Hello and welcome back to another episode of 8-Bit Monsters Monster Deconstruction for D&D 5th Edition. On today's episode, we're going to be looking at another one of my most viewed shorts from my YouTube channel. And if you want to check out my YouTube channel, you can check the description to see where that's at. Unless you're already at the YouTube channel and listening to this here, then thanks for watching, or listening. You can find the Cloud Giant Smiling One in Volo's Guide to Monsters, page 146. The Giant is a CR11 and is worth 7,200 XP, so this is a pretty big, pun not necessarily intended, monster for your players to be fighting. My favorite section of this is the encounter building and how to use it, and as I always say, I love using Xanathar's Guide to everything in the encounter building there. It makes encounter building so much easier than trying to use the original DMG's guide and doing the multipliers and stuff. Yes, there are builders online that you can use to help you out, but if you need a quick battle, Xanathar's Guide to everything is a perfect way to get those random encounters or planned encounters thrown together quickly. So with that, how could you use the Cloud Giant Smiling One as an epic encounter, where it's one of these giants versus all of your players at a much lower level? Well, you could start off with a party of 6 at 7th level, a party of 5 at 8th level, or a party of 4 at 9th level. After that, this giant becomes a group monster. Now, what I mean by group monster is having this monster in a group with other monsters, obviously. So you could start doing that at 11th level with 6 players, but usually not many groups have 6 players running around. So the next section would be 5 players at 12th. Again, you might have 5 players at your table, or more than likely you'll have 4 or 3. The average is usually 4, and you could start putting one of these giants against 4 of your players at 13th to 14th level. Again, if you have more than 4 players, then those other 2 players could be used to throw in some extra monsters to help protect and assist the giant if needed. And then you could put 3 players at 16th level up against one of these monsters, and then finally 2 players at 17th to 20th level. So considering that we're seeing this monster is still a challenge for 2 players at 20th level, gear dependent, you probably won't be seeing this as a solo monster. Again, trying to put one of these players up against one of these giants could be possible, but it is highly gear dependent, as I'd said previously. If your player has been loaded up with all sorts of treasure and legendary gear, then they probably could fight one of these giants by themselves. Ironically at 20th level. But at 20th level, what kind of campaign is throwing a CR11 at them? I'd be interested to know. And then finally, the swarm monsters is just not even possible. The CR is way too high for our giant, and there's no way, unless you went into the god levels of 21 to 30, which some campaigns do actually do, you might then be able to swarm your players with these, provided they're, level 21 to 25 or something and beyond. Anyways, looking at our skills and traits for the Cloud Giant Smiling One, the giant here has 3 saves, those being Constitution, Intellect, and Wisdom. Now, this will be reflected in the DCR section, so we won't spend too much time here. Moving on, the giant has innate spellcasting. Now, there's no damaging spells from this, but the monster build indicates gaining advantage for the attacks. And there are a couple spells here that could help give your giant advantage on the next round of combat, or prior to battle starting. Whatever works for you, or hopefully getting your giant advantage, because their attacks do kind of rely on getting advantage almost every round, but the final CR is not dependent on getting advantage. It's just one of those deals where this is kind of a weird rogue caster build because of this whole gaining advantage and then being able to do almost a sneak attack. We'll see that more in the OCR section. Next is the Keen Smell, and if you've been watching any of my videos, we know that Keen Smell has no effect on the monster's CR whatsoever. And then lastly, we have Spellcasting. Now there is one damaging spell, and that is Vicious Mockery. Now, I don't exactly understand why you might be using Vicious Mockery with this giant, considering it's not really going to scale up that well, and a lot of the other spells and abilities are going to do much more damage, especially if you're trying to do ranged damage, unless you want the players to have to roll for the DC check for the spell, because otherwise you could be slinging a rock at one of the players. Let's move on to the defensive challenge rating of our giant here. And as I said before, there are 3 saves on this giant, and because of this, it's going to get an effective bonus of +2 AC, shifting it from its base 15 to 17. Now, on top of it having those 3 saves, it can also cast Invisibility, which will give it advantage on attacks, but also makes it harder for players to hit this giant, even though it's invisible. So because of the fact that it's going invisible and giving disadvantage to the players, which is a very rare case, we can give this giant another effective AC boost of +2, shifting it from the 17 of the 3 saves to 19. So now our giant has an effective AC of 19 because of the saving throws that it has advantage on, and the invisibility spell. Now, there's nothing affecting our giant's hit points here, and the base hit points of 262 coming from the 20d12 plus 120 is going to rate this as a DCR 13 on the DMG chart for custom monsters and such. Now, if we're to look at that chart, we'll see that a DCR of 13 expects an 18 AC. Luckily, our giant's effective AC is only 19, which means this is +1 over the expected 18, and there's going to be no shift to the DCR 13. And because of the bonuses from the 3 saves and the bonus from invisibility, this giant's DCR isn't going to shift. Now let's take a look at the OCR. First attack that the giant has is its Morning Star. Now, when it swings it normally without advantage, it's going to be roughly 21 DPR. But if it does have advantage, it's going to bump it up to 35 DPR. We can also look at this when we look at the rock that it can throw, which is +30 DPR without advantage, or +44 DPR if it does have advantage. Now, some of these attacks will have a 0.5 marker here, which I didn't add in, which is important for the multi-attack. Speaking of the multi-attack, it can swing its Morning Star twice per round of combat, gaining a +43 DPR without advantage, or +71 DPR with advantage. So we're going to ignore the advantage for now, because there are some ways for the giant to gain advantage, but while it's in combat, if no one is giving the giant advantage, then it's going to generally sacrifice 1 round of combat, not dealing damage, and kind of reducing the amount that it can do. So we're going to look at this if it was just doing straight normal attacks regardless, without casting spells to gain advantage. So our average DPR here is going to be 43, and this 43 damage is going to result in an OCR of 6 when we look at the DMG chart for custom monsters again. Now, this OCR of 6 is expecting a +6 attack bonus. Our giant actually has an attack bonus of +12, which is pretty big. No pun intended here. Now, this is +6 over the expected, and because it's in multiples of 2, we divide this 6 by 2, and this results in a +3 shift from the OCR of 6 on our chart all the way up to OCR 9. A pretty big jump because of that high attack bonus that it gets. Okay, we have the DCR and the OCR set. Let's take a look at the FCR and see what we get here. Now, our DCR is a 13, and our OCR is a 9. When we add those together, we get a 22, and when we average that out, we get a CR 11. This is great because the printed CR of the monster is an 11, so technically this is even. But what happens if our monster uses its first round of combat to gain advantage? Well, round 1 will be no damage. Round 2 will be roughly +71 damage if it's swinging the Morning Star and not throwing the stone. I'm actually going to ignore the stones because it's so low and it can only throw it once that the damage is coming from its melee abilities. And then after round 2's advantage round, if it starts attacking again at normal, then it's going to be plus 43 damage. And this will result in an average DPR of 38 damage, because round 1 was 0, round 2 was 71, and round 3 was 43. Already we're seeing that the average DPR is much less if it had just been using the first round of combat to attack and just keep doing average standard damage without going for an advantage. Well, what happens here on our chart? If you look at the chart and see that the OCR 6 was from the 43 damage, 38 damage will actually rate this as an OCR 5, but we still get the plus 3 shift from its attack bonus, which bumps it up to an OCR of 8. Alright, let's apply this 8 to the 13 from its DCR, and we get a 21. This isn't a big deal here because when we average out the 21, we get 10.5, and we round up to the highest or lowest CR. In this case, because it's 0.5, using math rules, we round up to a CR 11. Alright, cool. So even if the giant sacrifices its first round of combat to gain advantage on the attack, it's still a CR 11. You would only want to do this once every 3 rounds of combat. So if battle goes into the 4th round of combat, then you could try and use another spell or ability to gain advantage for the 5th round of combat to have that heavy hit again. Alright, so we have that set here. What about if the giant already has advantage somehow? Maybe it's invisible before combat starts. Well, if that's the case, then round 1 will be 71 points of damage if it's on the front lines, and then rounds 2 and 3 will be 43 damage each because it doesn't have any way of gaining advantage unless it sacrifices another round of combat. And we don't want to do that, because we're trying to see how much more this CR could be for this giant here. Well, for those 3 rounds of combat, if it has advantage before battle begins, this will average out to plus 52 damage. Alright, so looking at our chart here, in the custom monster building section, we'll see that the OCR now becomes an 8. And again, because of its high attack bonus, this is going to result in a plus 3 shift from an 8 to an 11. Already you can kind of see where this is going here, and we'll apply the OCR 11 to the DCR 13, resulting in a 24, and averaging that out, we'll see a CR 12. So if our giant is on the front lines, somehow gets advantage prior to battle beginning, it's invised or something else happens to it, it's going to be 1 step higher than the printed value. And honestly, that's not too big of a deal, especially since what we said in the encounter building in the beginning of the episode, we don't need to worry too terribly much about the giant having a slightly higher CR by 1 step. It's not really going to do too terribly much for the overall combat. Especially after the first 3 rounds of combat, if the giant's still alive and still just swinging the mace normally, then it's going to slowly come back down to that CR 11. So it gets a little bit of a burst of damage, and then it gets the, standard amount of damage after that. Alright, battle tactics. How would I use this in battle? Well, considering it's a chaotic neutral giant, there's not a good chance that this giant would be ready for battle or invisible prior to it, unless there was some suspicion going around and they needed some of these smiling ones to be ready and invisible. If this was the case, then I wouldn't worry too much about gaining advantage and just keep swinging the mace. There are some good utility spells, but unless there are other allies in the front lines, then I would probably ignore them for the most part. Invisible will always be handy to try and get out of being swarmed, and there are some good control spells as well. Considering the high DCR of our giant, I would use this as a utility caster, buffing its allies and debuffing the enemies as needed. Get the most out of those spell slots before the players start focus firing on the giant. Use those spells to get away from the players, also if they've moved behind the front line somehow, and start trying to attack the giant at the backside of the combat area. So use some of the controlling spells to take advantage and manipulate the battlefield as much as possible. Now if the frontline allies for the giant are gone, then it's time to start using that Morning Star. These giants aren't necessarily meant to be on the front line, and should be placed in the back to help control and manipulate the battlefield as much as possible. So that's how I would use this giant, if I used it in a random encounter build that I had in my campaigns. Thank you for joining me as we deconstructed the Cloud Giant Smiling one from D&D 5th edition. Join us again next week as we deconstruct another monster from D&D 5th edition and break it down into its barest parts to see what is going on with these monsters.